I'll stand where I want.
On this Monday night, this Ontario rail blockade finally dismantled. Who was detained and what happens next?
We can both protect reconciliation and protect Canada's economy.
Plus, when will full rail service resume? Breaking news out of Alberta. A court rules the federal carbon tax is unconstitutional, where this leaves climate policy as a proposal for another massive oil sands mine is pulled. Italy's sudden surge of COVID-19 cases. Picturesque towns, now quarantine zones. And she was #1, celebrating mathematician Katherine Johnson and her winning equation for success.
Global National with Donna Friesen.
Good evening and thanks for joining us. We begin tonight with breaking news on multiple fronts, all of it related to resource projects in this country caught in the tension over climate policy and Indigenous rights. Late today, the Alberta Court of Appeal ruled the federal carbon tax is unconstitutional, that it can't be imposed by the federal government. A victory for Alberta's premier.
We promised Albertans that we would fight this federal carbon tax. We kept our promise, and today we've succeeded.
We'll get you more on that in just a moment, but also today, Teck Frontier bailed on its plan to build a $20 billion oil sands mine in northern Alberta. And in Tyendinaga, Ontario, at least one train along the CN rail line did start moving today after 19 days of blockades. In Vancouver, though, sympathizers with the Wet'suwet'en Chiefs have gathered at this key intersection during the rush hour, blocking access to the Port of Vancouver. Demonstrators were also here 2 weeks ago, prompting the port to get a court injunction to remove them. Protesters are also blocking rail tracks in nearby Maple Ridge tonight, forcing the cancellation of the West Coast Express train service.
I'll stand where I want. I'm in Oklahoma territory.
And this is just after 8 a.m. in Ontario. Dozens of Ontario Provincial Police officers moved in to end the blockade near Belleville. A handful of protesters who'd shut down passenger and freight trains were arrested. They were supporting a small group of Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs in northern BC who don't want the Coastal GasLink natural gas pipeline crossing their territory. Those chiefs are talking to the RCMP about removing a police outpost and seem willing to consider meeting federal ministers if that happens. The Prime Minister says it proves his strategy is working.
We demonstrated through this process that we can both protect reconciliation and protect Canada's economy as we move forward.
We'll get to the political challenge all this poses in just a moment. But first, David Akin on what happened at the rail blockade when the police moved in.
A midnight deadline to clear the blockade came and went. And as dawn broke on Tyendinaga, the blockade and its protesters remained in place. But not for long. At about 8 a.m. local time, a convoy of police vehicles moved to the barricade. The protesters themselves streamed what happened next on their Facebook page. An OPP community liaison officer asked the protesters once more to leave. But the protesters are defiant.
You leave, all of you.
And then, after a short speech from one of them,
I'll stand where I want.
a confrontation and arrests.
Yeah, me. That's up. That's up.
Police arrested 10 people on different charges. All were taken away in special police vehicles. They would be later released with conditions. And by day's end, back near the main blockade camp, dozens of community members and others gathered in support of those protesters.
I'm just really ashamed of Canada and the treatment of Indigenous people still ongoing to this day in 2020. It's just kind of disgusting.
Meanwhile, back in BC, the Wet'suwet'en wait for confirmation that the RCMP have indeed left their territory. Confirmation that could prompt the Mohawks and their supporters in Tyendinaga to finally stand down. As for the trains, it's not clear when regular service will resume. Both CN and VIA want to have that happen as soon as possible. CN crews were on the tracks as soon as the blockade was lifted, checking to make sure the tracks were safe and free of damage. Donna?
All right, and some trains are moving tonight. David Akin on Tyendinaga territory in Ontario. Thanks. Rail service may finally be getting back to normal, but the small group of Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs still don't want a pipeline through their territory, even though 20 elected band councils have consented to it. As Michael Couture reports, that crisis is still looming inside the House of Commons and outside on the streets.
Hundreds of protesters shut down parts of downtown Ottawa as they marched in solidarity with the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs. Signs like "Reconciliation is dead" signal this is about more than the natural gas pipeline in northern BC. The economic impact has yet to be measured as trains sat idle, but it's been blunted somewhat, according to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau.
We've been working with rail carriers to ensure that many trains continue to use alternate routes to get through, and that's one of the reasons we've been able to avoid some of the most serious shortages.
There have been concerns about critical shortages of chlorine and propane, which are normally moved by rail. And opposition parties say the Prime Minister's lack of action for more than 2 weeks has paved the way for future protesters.
There is now a clear playbook for radical activists to follow, and they know that the Prime Minister will do literally nothing as the economy is brought to its knees.
The government says it's committed to addressing the concerns of the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs who want to stop the gas pipeline project and want the RCMP off their land. The Mounties have left an outpost, and that's seen as a possible breakthrough.
We needed them to communicate that was to their satisfaction, to their supporters, coast to coast to coast. Unfortunately, that didn't happen, but that safety office is closed.
Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs were expected to verify the RCMP's withdrawal themselves. Instead, other protests continue to pop up across the country.
We're not only fighting days of suspicion and mistrust, but decades and even centuries in some cases.
Which is exactly why everyone on all sides is thinking about what happens now and for decades to come. Michael Couture, Global News, Ottawa.
Now to Alberta and what Premier Jason Kenney calls good news and bad news. First, the carbon tax. In a 4-1 decision, the Alberta Court of Appeal ruled federal carbon pricing is unconstitutional. The Alberta government argued a federally imposed carbon tax was a stepping stone that would allow Ottawa to interfere in provincial sovereignty. The court agreed, calling it a Trojan horse. Heather Yourex-West joins me from Calgary tonight. Heather, tell us more about the ruling and what it means.
Well, Donna, this isn't the first time that a province has challenged the federal carbon tax, but it is the first time a province has won. Courts in both Saskatchewan and Ontario upheld the tax last year. And of course, the Supreme Court will hear Saskatchewan's appeal this spring. The federal environment minister says Ottawa will wait to see what the Supreme Court ultimately decides, but says he feels confident that the federal position will be upheld. Alberta's premier, however, disagrees, maintaining that provinces should have jurisdiction when it comes to planning climate policies. Donna?
All right. Thanks, Heather. And we'll come back to you in just a moment. The other big story in Alberta is about Teck Frontier. It's pulled the plug on a huge oil sands project in Alberta just before the federal cabinet was poised to give it a final yes or no. It had support from Indigenous communities and had passed all environmental reviews. Yet the company's CEO said there is no constructive path forward. Don Lindsay says global capital markets are changing rapidly, and investors and customers are increasingly looking for jurisdictions to have a framework in place that reconciles resource development and climate change in order to produce the cleanest possible products. And that, he says, doesn't exist in Canada. To be viable, this project also needed higher oil prices, more pipeline capacity, and more foreign investors. It's another sign Canadian political leaders need to stop fighting and work together on a coherent climate policy. Here's Heather's report on that.
The massive Frontier mine proposal was seen as a beacon of hope for this small oil field servicing company.
There were no real major projects that were being announced. To hear the news this morning, I think was really devastating for a lot of people.
Teck Resources spent 9 years and $1 billion working the oil sands mega project through Canada's regulatory process. It had the support of Indigenous communities in the region. And despite questions around whether the project would be financially viable with oil down to $50 a barrel, the company believed it would be commercially viable. Instead, in his letter to the federal environment minister Sunday, Teck's CEO Don Lindsay placed blame on the political uncertainty around climate policy and the energy sector. The promise of Canada's potential will not be realized until governments can reach agreement around how climate policy considerations will be addressed. Without clarity on this critical question, it will be very difficult to attract future investment.
It's going to take some strong and clear leadership to send a different message to global investors, because right now it's pretty easy to see this as a negative on the end of a string of negatives.
Alberta's premier, who has been calling on Ottawa to approve the Teck mine since December, has been quick to place blame on the federal government. But the federal environment minister says he agrees with the points raised by Teck, that all levels of government need to get on the same page.
We agree. And we say we are taking strong action on climate change. We need to be working to collaborate with all of the provinces and territories. We need to be all on the same page, not fighting with each other over the price on pollution and those kinds of things. We need to be working together.
And there is support for a carbon tax across the energy industry. Teck CEO stated that support in his letter Sunday. The Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers reiterated that support today as well. It's really only a small group of provincial Conservative premiers, Donna, that are opposed.
All right, Heather, Yourex-West in Calgary tonight. Thanks. This balance between energy growth, environmental policy, and Indigenous rights poses a big challenge for political leaders, federal and provincial. Our Ottawa Bureau Chief Mercedes Stephenson joins me. Mercedes, there's a lot of anger, a lot of finger pointing, and now this Alberta Court of Appeal ruling that the carbon tax is unconstitutional. Where does this leave the Prime Minister?
Well, Donna, it's another challenge for Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, who has faced test after test of his leadership in government since being re-elected. And today's carbon tax decision adds to that mess, playing into heated partisan rhetoric across the country. Mr. Trudeau was elected on three key promises: the environment, the economy, and reconciliation. And now all three of those priorities are colliding in a perfect storm that has rocked his government. Mr. Trudeau managed to dodge the bullet of having to make a cabinet decision on Teck Frontier, but in the eyes of some out west, he is responsible nonetheless. Weighing in, the CEO of Teck Frontier said that what was missing was a clear framework untainted by politics that would lay out how the country could reconcile resource development with climate change. That's something that Mr. Trudeau has not managed to produce. Instead, there's a failure of a highly symbolic energy project and also no plan to meet the Kyoto targets, much less the zero carbon footprint he's promising. Mr. Trudeau's commitment to reconciliation is also on trial, with Indigenous leaders condemning today's OPP arrests, and the promise of more protests and blockades with the slogan "Shut Down Canada" has the business community warning that there could be fleeing foreign capital from Canada, and saying more big projects could be sidelined, with the economy being damaged if there isn't a solution soon. But make no mistake, this is not all on the Prime Minister. No other party has proposed a viable way forward on any of the three issues. There's lots of finger pointing but no constructive talk. Several premiers refuse to bend on the carbon tax, as Heather said, and the same goes for major contenders for the Conservative leadership like Peter MacKay, despite shifting public opinion on the environment. There seems to be a vacuum of leadership and a plan on all sides. Donna?
Okay, Mercedes Stephenson in Ottawa, thanks. The latest consequences of COVID-19 coming up, the misery it's creating for the markets, and Italian towns are quarantined. An update tonight on the outbreak of COVID-19. A seventh case has been confirmed in British Columbia. A man in his 40s is recovering in self-isolation. He's a close contact of a woman who was diagnosed last week. She contracted the virus in Iran and flew to Vancouver via Montreal. Canada now has 11 confirmed cases.
Though there is widespread transmission in some areas of the world, we are not in that position yet, but we are preparing for that.
Concern about a widening outbreak was enough to spook investors today. There are fears quarantines outside China could disrupt the world economy, and U.S. markets suffered their worst day in more than 2 years. The Dow Jones lost more than 1,000 points by the time markets closed. Canada's main index, the TSX, posted a triple-digit loss, down nearly 300 points. Here's what's going on with the COVID-19 virus. The biggest outbreak is still in China, more than 77,000 cases. But there are now rapidly expanding outbreaks in Japan and in South Korea, which now has more than 800 confirmed cases. And now northern Italy is affected too. More than 200 people there are ill. 6 have died, and 10 cities are under lockdown. And in Iran, there's confusion. One lawmaker said there have been 50 deaths. That's much higher than what the government is reporting. Today, the head of the World Health Organization said it is still not a pandemic, but as Crystal Goomansingh reports, no one is certain how many cases remain undetected.
Scarves and masks spotted all over the famous canals of Venice. COVID-19 is spreading in Italy. It's now the worst hit country in Europe. Police are blocking roads to 11 northern communities, isolating roughly 50,000 people. A measure similar to the lockdowns in cities in China aimed at stopping the spread of the virus.
China has taken one of the most ancient strategies for infectious disease control and rolled out probably the most ambitious and I would say agile and aggressive disease containment effort in history.
Led by Canadian Dr. Bruce Aylward, the World Health Organization's special investigation team has been working in China for weeks. The epidemic there peaked and plateaued between January 23rd and February 2nd, and according to the WHO, has steadily been declining since.
We are not witnessing large-scale severe disease or deaths. Does this virus have pandemic potential? Absolutely, it has. Are we there yet? From our assessment, not yet.
But fears remain. Just look at this huge lineup for masks in South Korea. No one has immunity to COVID-19. It's new, and scientists can't say if a person without symptoms can transmit the virus. Back in Italy, officials say those who have died have been elderly and had pre-existing health conditions. There are concerns the virus is being underreported in some countries. A team with the WHO is set to arrive in Iran on Tuesday. More cases are surfacing there, and it's a key point for travel in the Middle East. Crystal Goomansingh, Global News, London.
Still ahead, the king of the red carpet headed to prison. The American president addressed a packed stadium in India today. More than 100,000 people were there. It's Donald Trump's first official trip to India. He's developed strong ties with India's Hindu nationalist leader Narendra Modi. And this 36-hour trip was filled with pageantry and photo ops, but not a lot of substance. The two countries face tensions over trade and are trying to tighten their security cooperation. The man who used to be known as the king of Hollywood, the movie mogul who could make or break careers, is in jail tonight. Harvey Weinstein has been found guilty of sex crimes and will now forever be known as a convicted rapist. Prosecutors believe the case surrounding the disgraced Hollywood producer will change the way the courts consider other victims of sexual assault. Jackson Proskow on the verdict and the reaction.
Harvey Weinstein displayed little emotion as the verdict was read. Guilty of rape and a criminal sex act. Not guilty on 3 more serious charges, including predatory sexual assault.
It's a new day because Harvey Weinstein has finally been held accountable for crimes he committed.
It's a victory for the dozens of women who've accused the former Hollywood mogul of sexual misconduct and assault. The conviction focused specifically on 2 accusers, Miriam Haley and Jessica Mann. Jurors also had to consider the testimony of 4 other women, including Annabella Shora, who starred in The Sopranos. She claimed Weinstein raped her in the early 1990s. Weinstein never spoke in his own defense. Immediately after the verdict, he was led away in handcuffs to await sentencing.
I don't think he was ready to be taken into custody, but he was a gentleman. He was fine.
The conviction is a watershed moment for the Me Too movement. The accusations against Weinstein launched a reckoning, empowering women everywhere to speak up against their abusers, even the rich and powerful.
This is the age of empowerment of women, and you cannot intimidate them anymore.
Weinstein faces up to 25 years in prison. His defense plans to appeal, and prosecutors in Los Angeles are moving ahead with a second, more expansive case involving 4 more charges. Jackson Proskow, Global News, Washington.
Next, she was one of the hidden figures who took the space race to new heights.
God knew they couldn't be on this earth without each other.
It was me. That's Vanessa Bryant talking about her husband Kobe Bryant and their 13-year-old daughter Gianna, who were killed in a helicopter crash last month. 20,000 people filled the Staples Center in Los Angeles for a public memorial to them, including celebrities and athletes. Vanessa Bryant today also filed a wrongful death lawsuit against the helicopter operator involved in the crash that killed the NBA superstar, his daughter, and 7 others. NASA is mourning the loss of a pioneer. She wasn't an astronaut, she was a mathematician, and her work helped launch the first American into space and put the first human on the moon. Katherine Johnson also broke down racial and social barriers along the way. Johnson has passed away at the age of 101, and tonight Mike Armstrong looks at her incredible legacy.
The accolades for Katherine Johnson came late in life. But there were some big ones. This was the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 2015. There's also NASA's computational research facility that bears her name and several honorary degrees. This for a woman who would walk into meetings and have men assume she was the maid. Well, she was there for the math. The tougher the problem, Katherine Johnson would say, the more she enjoyed it.
They thought it was hard. It's not hard. Piece of cake.
Born in West Virginia in 1918, Johnson grew up loving something most might think strange, counting. As a young girl, whether it was the number of steps on the street or steps to school or the cutlery she'd washed, she counted everything. Well, by 15, she was in university. By 18, she had 2 degrees. She only attended graduate school when it was desegregated by court order. In 1952, Johnson joined the agency that would become NASA. She was part of a segregated unit that did computing.
544 miles per hour.
Now, the role of the women in that unit was overlooked and untold for decades, until a book and then a movie, Hidden Figures. They tell the story of the gender and racial barriers the women faced, but also what they accomplished. Johnson did the analytic geometry that calculated the trajectory of the first American in space and Apollo 11's mission to the moon. There's a scene in the movie where legendary astronaut John Glenn questions calculations done by a machine and demands Johnson go over them.
You mean Katherine? Yes, sir. Smart one. I mean, she says they're good. I'm ready to go.
So you checked the computer's numbers, and what did you come up with?
The same numbers the computer had. And he knew that if I had done it, it was right.
Now, Johnson did have a trick to accomplish what she did. It was that love of counting and her passion for numbers. She would say, do your best, but do what you love. If you don't do what you love, then shame on you.
What a role model. That is Global National for this Monday. I'm Donna Friesen. Tonight's Your Canada is Turtleford, Saskatchewan. We'd love to see your Canada. Please email it to us. And thanks for watching. Hope to see you here again tomorrow. Bye-bye.